Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my channel where today I'm going to talk a little bit about poetry again. It has been a long time since I did any poetry readings or otherwise talked about books, and it is something I want to do more of on my channel. I know that quite a few of you who subscribe to my channel do it because you have subscribed when watching one of my poetry videos. So today I am starting a new series of videos where I will go through all of Edmund Spenser's sonnets, or the sonnets of his sonnet cycle, Amoretti, which is one of his two famous works. It's two famous works that Edmund Spenser wrote. It was the Faerie Queene, which is one of the longest epic poems written in English, and then there is Amoretti, which is a cycle of sonnets, which I think is about 80 of them. And the Faerie Queene was written to some extent for Queen Elizabeth I, and Amoretti, the sonnets, were written for Edmund Spenser's future wife at the time, whose name was Elizabeth Boyle. So they were both called Elizabeth, and there is actually a reference to this in the sonnets as well. So a little bit about Spenser. So Spenser lived from 1552 to 1599, one of the greatest poets of English. But there's one thing that lots of people will notice right away with Spenser that sets him apart from other poets, and that is that even today we do tend to write his poetry with the original orthography, that is, the original spelling of the words. And this is quite unusual. He is the only 16th century poet for whom we do this. Indeed, usually the only difference you see from the original would be that in Spenser's day, the letters U and the letters V were one and the same. You just used them in different parts of the words. And so the only modernization that tends to be done to Spenser is to replace the U's with the V's where that's the correct normal modern spelling. The rest is usually left untouched. And why is he the only Elizabethan writer for whom we do this? It's quite strange because we don't do it for Shakespeare, we don't do it for Marlowe, we don't do it for Walter Raleigh, etc., etc. Even though some readers of Shakespeare might feel that his language is so archaic that it may as well have been spelt in an archaic way, but it isn't. It isn't spelt in the original orthography. Shakespeare is modernized in spelling, the way we read it today. Well, the thing is, Spenser had a fanciful notion, I call it, that using archaic language made his poetry more poetic. This is a notion that indeed many contemporary poets still have, because many poets use the archaic forms for the second person singular in their poetry, that is, thou instead of you, and thee, of course, when you is an object. Which is an archaism. And also there are words like ear in the meaning of before, which also is an archaic word, etc., and things like that. And people think that this lends a certain poeticness to poetry to use archaisms in their work. And maybe it does. Maybe it does. I'm not going to dispute that, because it does remind you, I think, in a way, of a certain style of poetry that was prevalent in the Renaissance, Elizabethan eras, which, of course, is what many people associate with poetry. So why did he do that? Well, he thought he wanted to make it look more poetic, and so he took words and he spelt them the way that they were spelt in Chaucer, for instance. So the Canterbury Tales, Middle English. So he took some borrowings from Middle English and used them in his work, and sometimes he just made up spellings as well. And also because even though we had some system to this, sometimes you will also find that words that are the same are spelt differently in his poems as well. It's very hard to keep up a sort of consistent style when you have this notion of writing archaically. And the same thing is true of contemporary poets who use thou and thee, but then they use other words that don't actually fit with that style at all. And sometimes they might actually put in you as well in the same poem, in the same meaning. And that is a sort of break of style that can be quite jarring. So even in his own time, this was looked upon as rather a peculiar thing to do. And Ben Jonson, the English poet as well, famously said of Spenser that he writ no language. That's what Jonson said. And I am quite inclined to agree with it. So the thing is that some people argue that this strange choice of orthography that Edmund Spenser used, that it added another layer of meaning to his poetry, because by using a different spelling, you can introduce different double meanings. You can refer to things in the etymology of the words. And of course, the thing about poetry generally is that it's a layer of different meanings. So if something is said in a certain way, and you can read what it says on the line, but there may be other meanings that are possible. And in a poem, all possible meanings are, in a way, true at the same time. Whereas in normal language, usually you're trying to communicate just a single, very specific meaning. That is your aim, whereas in poetry you often try to communicate several meanings in with a single line of words. But I disagree with this view that it adds double meanings to his poetry. I think that if that is true, why do you not do the same for Shakespeare, for instance? Because if you look at Shakespeare and the way he writes, there is a lot more double meaning that is actually lost if you don't know the original spelling or the original pronunciation of the words. And of course, the pronunciation at the time would have been closer to the spelling at the time as well. So when you have original spelling, original orthography of Shakespeare, and you know how the vowels were at the time because they went through a few vowel shifts, you do get meanings that are lost in translation, as it were, in a modernized spelling of Shakespeare and a modernized way of pronouncing the words. So if you do it for Spenser, why don't you do it for Shakespeare? That doesn't make any sense. So and if you look at Spenser and you translate it, as it were, into modern English, or you certainly modernize it as you would for Shakespeare, and of course you have to keep some archaic word forms because you don't want to change the words themselves. You just want to change the spelling to reflect modern ways of doing it. Then it becomes quite apparent quite quickly that his poems are a lot easier to read than they otherwise would have been. So I think that the orthography is an unnecessary and highly pretentious even layer of pseudo-archaic complexity that it adds nothing of substance, in my view, to his poetry. And his poems are far easier to read and more accessible if you remove that layer of pretentiousness. And it becomes so much more enjoyable to read, and it's easier to find out what am I reading here. You look at it and it looks like a foreign language to many people when you look at it. So in this video series, I will read all of Edmund Spenser's sonnets, every single one from Amoretti, and I will put up on the screen as well the original orthography and also a modernized orthography. I've gone through all the poems and I've modernized the orthography, I've also done a little bit with the punctuation as well. I've just done what you would have done with Shakespeare, basically, to modernize it. And also, there are a few archaic words that don't really change the poetry of it, I should say. So, for instance, there are archaic word forms such as mote. He uses the word mote, and that means the same as the modern word might. And again, it's something that keeps you from understanding the meaning of the poem. So I have changed that. He uses sith in the meaning of since. He uses ensample, which is the original of example, and he uses comptrol, which is, of course, the modern control. So these words have actually changed because they don't change the poetry of it, as far as I can tell in any of these poems. So there are some word forms I have had to keep, of course, because they are part of the poetic structure, the sonic structure, the rhythmic structure of his work, and so they need to be preserved and just modernized in spelling as far as possible. So, because it is important to preserve the poetic rhythm, because if you know how to write poetry, you know that rhythm, or you should know that rhythm is really the most important structural element to poetry written in English. It is the foundation on which everything else sits. And Spenser, he was also very particular about his meter and his rhythm, and it's one of those things that it's important to try to preserve when you are reading them as well. So what I will do, because this is quite a modern convention now, but I do read them with the modern vowel values. Many vowels have changed sounds since Spenser's time, and this is also one of the causes of a phenomenon that I think it showed up in the 19th century. There was not before that. There's a concept of I rhymes or half rhymes, where you have I rhymes where you have two words in a rhyming position that look like normally you would think they would rhyme because of the structure of the poem, but they have different vowel sounds. But sometimes they're written the same way. And this is quite a modern notion of the I rhyme or the half rhyme, and it exists because of poems like Spenser and Shakespeare, who wrote perfect rhymes, but later the vowels changed pronunciation in one of the two rhyming words. And so suddenly you have a situation where you have two words that don't rhyme anymore. But it's not the poet who did this on purpose. So any modern notion that a half rhyme or I rhyme is a thing, or it used to be a thing, is not true. People do it now. Emily Dickinson famously did it a lot. And many poets of the 20th century and 21st century, they do it too, inspired by the idea that came on in the early 19th century, I believe, that there was such a thing as I rhymes and half rhymes that were intended, and they can work as a poetic figure as well, as a poetic device. So there's nothing wrong with that, but one should just be aware that when you have a half rhyme or an I rhyme in poetry that is from the 17th century and before, it is not intended. It was originally pronounced the same way, or it was pronounced the same way in the writer's way of speaking. So yeah, so it's a very common misconception, I think, that there was such a thing in the olden days. For instance, I'll give a few examples. Actually, I just made a note of some here, so I'll just go through those. So in Spenser, we have the words alone is put in a rhyming position with the word none, and of course you can see they have the same ending, and presumably they would have been pronounced alone and none in Spenser's time. I'm just guessing there because I don't know that 100% for sure. Others, proud, rhyming with food, And of course, that would have been prudent food, presumably. Eyes, enemies, quite a common one. I'm not sure exactly how that would have been pronounced in Spenser's day, but it could have been eyes, enemies, A's, enemies. I'm not sure exactly how that was pronounced. Find and wind, and again, that would have been find and wind. And I rhyming with destroy, and that is because it would have been oi rhyming with destroy. So those are perfect rhymes in Spenser's day, but now they are half rhymes or I rhymes, depending on whether the ending is still written in the same way. So another thing, of course, that when people talk about I rhymes is that in that time, poetry was not intended to be read to the same extent as it was intended to be listened to, so read out loud for people to experience as a listener rather than as a reader. And that also makes a big difference to the concept because nowadays poetry is something that lots of people read quietly to themselves, looking at a page. And of course, that is a very different experience to reading it loud or listening to somebody reading it loud. And you get a very different impression of it, both the rhythm and the sounds of it, when you do it inside. And so I rhymes, of course, that's a strange concept to a mostly oral tradition, for instance. Let's see. I made a few notes here and just see if there was something else I wanted to say. Right. Yes. So when I do this series of videos with Spenser's sonnets, I do intend also to put in explanations for words that either have changed meaning in the modern day or that are so archaic that I can't expect anyone viewing it to know what I mean. And of course, saving you a trip to Wikipedia or Wiktionary most of the time, because I mean many of these words are to be found on Wiktionary, which is a very good resource for lots of things to do with the old language, actually. Right. Let's see. Yeah, I did want to say something more about rhythm. I did say earlier that rhythm is the foundation on which the rest of the poem rests. And there is another quite a modern notion of meter inversion. I know that, I mean, the thing is, there's a sort of general sense that poetry in English it's quite a modern notion. A poetry in English shouldn't have a very regular rhythm going all the way through. So bum 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 bum, because it gets a bit boring. So every now and again you need to break that rhythm, which is the meter of the poem, the regular meter of it, with an inversion where you swap a stressed and unstressed syllable around. So bum 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 bum, etc. That sort of thing. And of course, there are many ways to do this. One of the ways that is the most elegant, and which is what Dorothy Parker does, is that she doesn't have any meter inversions per se, because what she does instead is to have different line lengths. So not all lines have the same number of syllables. So she can start a line on a stressed syllable and end on a stressed syllable. And if you do that on every line, then the different line lengths will actually create that dynamism of having the changing rhythm. So you don't need to do it in any other way. But for what is quite common, though, of course, in Renaissance poetry, is you have the same line length all along. So in your sonnets, you usually have the same number of syllables per line, the same number of lines, etc. And so one of the ways to create more dynamic feel to the rhythm is to have inversions. Now, there are two ways to interpret an inversion. One is that it creates tension by pronouncing it the opposite of the meter. So that's the modern notion, I think, where you would pronounce it the other way around and so create tension. But you would also create tension by pronouncing something in a way that is different to the rhythm that that word or phrase would normally have. And I think that was more common in Elizabethan poetry. That's my general theory, because there are some words, and usually there are quite strict rules. If you read poetry from the 16th century and the 17th century, you'll notice there are it's quite sort of regular what kind of words that get the metre inversion feel to them. So there are words like present participles and gerunds, like running, walking, etc. They often have a slightly ambiguous rhythm in poetry, and often you find that the ing part is the one that is placed in the meter where you normally would expect a stressed syllable to be. So that is quite interesting. So did I have any examples of that? So in other words that often get stressed that wouldn't need to, I mean, and often you wouldn't expect it to, are very sort of small single syllable words, words like in, of, at, the, etc. And of course, in many cases, when you read poetry, you can find that you can either read them as an unstressed syllable and you invert the meter completely, or you can change the stress of those syllables to be stressed. So to do an example from Spenser now, and read the sorrows of my dying sprite. That's how I would normally read it. But of course, if you want to invert it and read the sorrows of my dying sprite, so of course you do a slight change there in the rhythm. So it is possible to read it both ways, but I think that generally the intention of the writers of that era was that you would have that regular meter and you would stress the word of. But that is my theory, and one of the wonderful things about poetry, I think, is that it's an individual experience. You want to read them the way that you want to read them, the way you feel them yourself, the way they speak to you. And so there is no wrong or right. As a poet myself, I do, of course, have my own poetry, and I know how I want it to be read and how I read it myself. And I know some poets, they actually can be quite frustrating. And I've never heard anyone else read my poetry out loud. But I know some poets, they actually can be quite frustrated because they spend so much time putting their verse into meter, and then somebody else reads it and they don't read it in meter. I have heard some people word that frustration, though. Right. I think that is about everything I wanted to say now. I think I've run out of notes that I have on my screen behind the camera here. So yes, Edmund Spenser, a fascinating poet, but because of the way that he usually is written with the old-fashioned archaic orthography, and that was even archaic in his own time, it is harder to read and it is less accessible than it needs to be. But if you change the spelling, which doesn't take a lot of work, then suddenly he is very accessible. The meaning of his poems become much clearer, because the spelling can actually obscure the meaning completely. And I think it is simply more enjoyable to read. So, but in this series, I will put up, of course, the original as well as the new one. You can make your own choice which one you prefer to look at. It will still sound the same when you read it out, pretty much, with very few exceptions, because I will say might instead of mote, and I will say since instead of sith or sith. But there is actually a case of sith. There's a or sith, yeah. There's a case of a word sithens, I think, with a two-syllable version of since. That can't be changed, of course, because it is two syllables. It needs to be two syllables for the sake of the meter. So there you go. Anyway, I hope you will enjoy this series and this introduction to it. So if you do, then please remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and join me on Patreon. Buy me a coffee on buymeacoffee.com. And yeah, I will leave you with a series. I will post this video at the same time as I post the first sonnet of Spenser's from the Amoretti sonnet cycle. And I hope this will be enlightening enough for you. Oh, by the way, one more thing, just one more thing, like Columbo used to say. So because of rhythm in Renaissance poetry often includes pronouncing the E in participles. So for instance, the word derived in modern English most commonly in Spenser's time would be pronounced derived. And the E is there, and it is pronounced in most of these words. And in my modernization of the text, I will also put an accent over the E to indicate where it is supposed to be pronounced, to make it clearer. And it's very easy to find out where it needs to be pronounced, because you can just count the syllables of the line, and you know that if there is a syllable lacking, if you read it normally, you know that there should be one more. Then that is often the place where you find there is an extra syllable. You have to, for instance, there's the line of Helicon whence she derived is. And of course, that's where you have derived instead of derived. So if you say of Helicon whence she derived is, it doesn't really go with the rhythm of the poem. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you later with more poetry videos and other videos. Goodbye for now.